Good evening, and welcome to this week's episode of Tuesday Night Talks, where I talk about a topic. Now, this week I think I'm going to do something a little more interactive. Obviously, it can't be interactive since I am talking to a camera and you're watching me on your screen. But let's suspend disbelief here and lean into that parasocial relationship here. Alright, I'd like you to focus up. Maybe close your eyes, look at your lap or something. Really hone in on what I'm about to ask you to do. Alright? I want you to remember a few things. The first thing is probably the hardest. I want you to think back to as far back as you can remember, your earliest memory from your childhood. Alright? Maybe pause the video. Give it a few moments. You remember? Alright. Now, I want you to remember what you had for breakfast this morning. Hopefully you had breakfast this morning. Eating breakfast is a very good thing for you to do to your body. Do you remember? Alright. Now one more thing. When was the last time you heard your favorite song? Hopefully you have a favorite song. I have a favorite song. You remember that song, but when was the last time you heard it? Think about that. Remember it. Alright. Sweet. This week's episode is going to be on memory, specifically the fallibility of memory. Alright, why did I have you remember those things? Alright, I think each one of them demonstrates a concept. Well, we'll start with your first childhood memory. The average human starts developing consciousness and starts remembering things around age 4. Obviously, psychologists disagree. They always do. They disagree as to why it is that we gain consciousness at that age, but the general consensus is our first memories will be around the age of 4 or 5. One of my earliest memories is when construction was being done on my house. I remember climbing through the rebar before the concrete would be poured for the foundation. It's a quite fond memory for me, and it's maybe I was a bit younger then. I think I was about 3, but within that age range is when people start, forming memories. Now, I'll talk more on how we form memories in a bit. All right. What about the second question? What did you have for breakfast this morning? I had pancakes for breakfast this morning. I had 2 pancakes with maple syrup. I also had a protein bar that was kind of ass. I'm going to be totally honest with you. And I had a cup of coffee. I was in a bit of a rush this morning. Hopefully you had breakfast, and you shouldn't have that hard of a time remembering what you had for breakfast this morning, assuming, again, that you did, which you should. It's one of those more mundane things that you don't really pay attention to, but it's recent enough that it should still be fresh enough in your short-term memory that you can remember it. All right, what about that third thing? That third thing, what is your favorite, or not what is your favorite song? When was the last time you heard your favorite song? Now, that one is probably the hardest of the 3. Obviously, the first one, it's kind of hard to pick out that one memory. But remembering the last time you heard your favorite song is very difficult. Why is that? Well, I don't know about you, but I listen to my favorite song a bunch, right? Obviously, whenever it comes up on shuffle on my playlist, I listen to it. Maybe I cue it up 2 or 3 times. It's a song that I find applicable for a lot of scenarios, so I listen to it for a variety of situations. Right? I could not tell you the last time that I listened to my favorite song. I couldn't tell you whether it came up on shuffle or if it was a conscious decision to put on, because it's one of those things that is obviously very, deeply personal to me, but not something that I think about all the time. Because it's so familiar to me, right? The familiarity of something, I think, is one of the big barriers to remembering things. What do I mean by that? Now is the part where I get to talk about how we form memories. Maybe not exactly how, but the way in which we form memories. Distinction without a difference, maybe. But the way that we form memories as people is different than the way a computer would save a file, right? You'd think that when we remember an event, we, remember what our surroundings look like, what it smelled like, what we heard, what we saw. That's redundant. What we felt, what things tasted like, what we heard, right? All of our senses would work together and combine to form a memory. Not really. It is very possible for to have a memory that is, let's say, for example, just a smell, right? That doesn't mean that in that moment you weren't seeing something. Like, let's say, for example, the a dish that you had when you were younger. Maybe one of your favorite dishes that your parents cooked. You might not remember the time that that one time that you ate it, but you can remember that smell, right? That very distinct smell. That doesn't mean that in that moment you weren't also experiencing what it tasted like, the sounds around you when you were eating. But you only remember that one specific aspect of the memory. Now, going back to music. When I study, when I've studied in the past, I usually put on music. I'm a very big music listener. I really enjoy listening to music. And one of my teachers from when I was younger, he would always put on bossa nova music. It was a same exact set of songs from some radio station, but it was bossa nova. That was what we would listen to, right? And whenever I do math, because he was a math teacher, I am reminded of bossa nova music. Whenever I hear bossa nova music, which isn't very often at all, I think of, algebra. Now, when I study myself, I put on a playlist that is all the different versions of The Weekend Whip by The Fold. That's the Lego Ninjago theme, if you don't know. And for every season, they do a remix of the original song. I don't know how many they're on now. It's a lot. But that familiarity of that song, because having music playing helps me focus, right? That's why I play music, is so that I can tune out all the other noises, the din around me, so that I can focus on, the work that I'm doing. But the familiarity of that song, I know the lyrics by heart, I know each of these versions, like the back of my hand. It helps me, I can ignore that as well, right? Because it's familiarity. I'm not going to be remembering that. It's not going to be, something that I'm consciously thinking about. Kind of like, the last time you heard your favorite song, you didn't remember it because, well, maybe you did, but you wouldn't remember it because it's so familiar to you that it's easier to ignore. But what about that association between algebra and bossa nova? I also listen to music when I'm reading. You'd think, well, that's kind of odd, especially if it's lyrical music. How can you read words off a page and process lyrics at the same time? Yeah, don't believe me. It's a bit odd. But because of that, there are certain songs that I hear and I immediately think of a passage from a book, right? Or when I'm rereading a book, I'm reading the words on the page and I'm also remembering a song lyric. It's, human minds have a tendency to make connections like that, right? That association. That's why things like, what is it called? Mnemonic devices, associating something with a tune is a very, very powerful tool for, recall. But what about I said earlier, the fallibility of memory? All right. Well, obviously, memories aren't perfect because we, don't save memories like a computer would save a file. Again, we, process each of these inputs differently, and, oftentimes we don't remember all of the things. memories are very prone to being misremembered. How is that? Well, every time you remember an event, right? You're not remembering the event. You are remembering the last time you remembered that event. It can be akin to a game of telephone, right? I'm sure you're familiar with a game of telephone where everyone sits in a row or a circle. A message originates from one person, gets whispered along the line, and turns out very different by the time it reaches the last person, because that last person did not hear what the first person said. They heard what the person before them heard, and what did that person hear? What the person before them had heard. It changes over time. One small change can have very profound impacts. The butterfly effect, right? Every time you remember something, you're not remembering that event, you're remembering the last time you remembered it. All right, so at the beginning of the video, when I asked you to recall that first childhood memory, you weren't recalling that memory, you were recalling the last time you remembered it. And now, next time you think about it, you won't be remembering it the same way that you did right now or the previous time, right? It has changed ever so slightly. Right? Think about writing lines on a chalkboard or something. You'll maintain it pretty well, but eventually you will make a mistake. And if you can't reference the original message that you were writing, you will continue to make that same mistake, and then mistakes will compound on each other, kind of like evolution. The mutations stack up over time, and eventually you end up with something entirely different. The light in the background is kind of annoying. I just realized that. Why is it that I decided to do this video? Ooh, annoying light. When I was younger, this would be before the COVID-19 pandemic, which was a whopping 6 years ago now. Time flies, right? There was a girl I knew, right? We had classes together, and we were fairly good friends, I would say. We got along fairly well together, and all was going swimmingly until quarantine hit, right? And then we had to, we got shipped home for a year or two, and we couldn't really keep in touch because I didn't have a phone at the time, so I wasn't able to get her number. And I saw her little box on the video calls for classes, but by the time we'd returned, she had moved schools, and we both went on with our lives. Every time I remember her, I'm not remembering, obviously I remember the nickname she had for me. I remember what her face looks like. I can, look at her photo in the yearbook. But the memories that we made together, I'm not recalling them. I'm recalling the last time I made them, or the last time I recalled them, not the time that I made them. And so over time, in the 6 years now, over 6 years it's been since we, went on lockdown. The way that I have recalled those events has changed, and changed in ways that I cannot know, right? Because again, I can't reference the original event. And that's what I mean when I'm talking about the fallibility of memory, right? You can't know how much has changed. That's the real fault with memory. Is not that it can be changed and it will be changed. All right, that's all well and good, as long as you know what and how it's been changed, right? That's the real issue here. And it makes me wonder, obviously it's been 6 years, and I assume she's a very different person now, as I'm sure I know I've grown up since then. And I always thought before I learned the way memory works. I assume that memories were like a time capsule, you know? You take a photo and it's frozen in time. When I learned that that is not in fact the case, it kind of shook me to my core a little bit because the picture that I have of this girl in my head, the memories that I remember, they're not time capsules. They're not infallible. They are not absolute. They are, in fact, very fickle. And every time I think about them, they change. It's kind of like the game. You lost the game. Every time by trying not to think about the game, you are thinking about the game and therefore losing the game. Thinking about, these memories, every time you remember them, they change, right? And then therefore, you're losing the game. And kind of a weird comparison there. But this realization, I think has changed me most because I can't do anything about it, right? There's no way to combat it, right? I can reconcile myself with the fact, but I can't do anything to fix it or to fight it, right? Again, like the game, the silly analogy. No matter what you're doing, working towards it, you're working against it, right? Does that make sense? I'm gonna assume it makes sense. And it sort of becomes this ship of Theseus sort of deal, because at what point is the memory completely different? Obviously, I'm sure it would take a very long time for a memory to get completely rewritten, to lose its meaning entirely and become, so different that it's unrecognizable. I'm going to assume, but again, I can't know that. No one can know that because we can't reference that original. And that's, I don't know, that's what kind of scares me, because I know that it's a lie, right? But I don't know to what extent, right? And if you don't know to what extent it's a lie, you kind of assume that it's entirely a lie. Obviously, I assume that it's not entirely, these memories aren't entirely, refabricated. But I can't know that. And it's that unknowing that scares me, right? It's the ship of Theseus. Is, by the time Theseus gets to the end of his voyage, his ship is completely rebuilt out of new parts, right? Is that still the same ship? Is the memory still the same? Is it still intact, right? Obviously, it's been redone, but at what point do you lose the essence of the memory? I can't know. And, it does make me wonder, though. Is that where nostalgia comes from, right? Obviously, I'm not talking about nostalgia for a time that you didn't experience, but when you think back to, your previous experiences, are you viewing it through rose-tinted glasses, right? The idea that you're looking at it through a more positive light, right? You're remembering these events in such a way that, makes them seem more positive than they were. Or maybe you're remembering a negative event and your attitude towards that memory causes you to remember it in a way that was worse than it actually was. I don't know, but that's something to think about. How does our emotional state contribute to the way we remember things? Here on Tuesday Night Talks, sometimes I start off with a question. Sometimes I answer that question. Other times I leave you with more questions. But instead of leaving you on, well, obviously those questions, but I'd like to leave you with a statement. Thank you for watching. This has been Tuesday Night Talks. Good night.